The morning sky hung over the quiet neighborhood in a soft gray, not quite gloomy, but muted as if the day itself were unsure how to begin. On the edge of town, where the pavement cracked into gravel roads and the scent of autumn lingered in the air, a small figure stood before a modest house with a hesitant heart. Margaret Drew tugged at the sleeves of her wool coat, her fingers nervously tightening around the handle of an old leather handbag. She had carried that bag for decades back when she was a newlywed, rushing to catch the morning bus with her husband Henry, always late but always laughing. The laughter had long since faded. Henry had passed 5 years ago. And now Margaret mostly talked to the walls. She squinted at the slip of paper in her hand. The writing was neat, but a little smudged. Family in need of a cook. Room, meals, and companionship provided. Inquire within. It had been handed to her by a neighbor who volunteered at the church. You always did love to cook, woman had said gently, pressing the flyer into Margaret's palm. Maybe it's time to be around people again. At first, Margaret wanted to scoff. What good was cooking for strangers when she barely remembered how to hold a conversation? Any more? Still, something about those words, companionship provided, had stayed with her. It wasn't about income. It was about not being invisible anymore. And so, here she was. The house in front of her was modest 2 stories, white siding faded by time, and a porch that creaked in the wind. A swing hung loosely from one corner, its chain rusted and barely moving. Toys, plastic dinosaurs, a tricycle with one bent wheel were scattered near the steps, signs of life. Children, perhaps. She hadn't expected that. Margaret hesitated. The urge to turn around, to claim it was all a mistake, almost overtook her. But her feet, aching and unsure, remained rooted to the spot. She glanced up at the window on the 2nd floor, where a faint curtain twitched. Someone had seen her. With a sigh that carried the weight of years. She raised her gloved hand and knocked. The door opened after a few seconds. A man in his mid-30s stood there, dark hair tousled, shirt wrinkled, and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. Behind him, the hallway buzzed with quiet chaos cartoon sounds from a television, the clatter of a toy being dropped, a child's voice shouting something unintelligible. He blinked at her, confused at first. Then realization dawned. You're here about the cooking job? Margaret nodded, her voice soft but steady. I was told you needed a cook. The man stepped aside quickly, opening the door wider. Yes, please, come in. Sorry, it's been a little crazy here. She stepped inside, taking in the smell of a house-stretched thin burnt toast, baby powder, unwashed laundry. A blanket lay crumpled on the couch, and a half-eaten sandwich sat on the coffee table beside a coloring book. I'm Daniel, he said, offering a hand. It's just me and my 2 kids now. My wife passed last year. Margaret's breath caught slightly. That wasn't in the flyer. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. He nodded, avoiding her eyes. It's been hard. I work from home, but it's impossible to keep up. The kids need structure, real meals, something better than cereal and frozen pizza. She offered a faint smile. Children can tell when something's missing. Daniel exhaled. Exactly. My son's been having trouble sleeping. My daughter won't eat unless someone sits with her. I'm not doing great, and they're getting the worst of it. His words hung in the air, unvarnished and honest. Margaret appreciated that. She looked down the hall, catching a glimpse of a child's face peeking around the corner, big brown eyes, half curious, half cautious. Margaret offered a small wave. The child ducked away. I didn't know there were children, she said. I didn't want to scare anyone off. Daniel admitted. Margaret chuckled lightly. Children don't scare me. There was a long pause. The kind that decides whether 2 people become strangers or something else. Then Daniel stepped aside fully and gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like to see where you'd be working?" She nodded, taking a step forward. "I would." As her footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood floor, Margaret felt something stir in her chest, small, uncertain, but real. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was hope that she had come to cook. She didn't know yet that she'd been invited into something far greater. A second chance. The kitchen was a quiet sort of disaster. Dishes were stacked precariously in the sink, and a sticky trail of orange juice led from the fridge to the table. A loaf of bread sat open, half stale, beside a jar of peanut butter with the lid missing. Margaret surveyed the room with a practiced eye, noting the signs of a household trying its best to function, one that had clearly been through more than most. Daniel scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Sorry, I meant to clean up a bit before you came, but the morning kind of got away from me." "It always does." Margaret stepped further into the room, not judging but observing. "It's not the mess that matters, it's the people in it." He let out a breath, half relieved. "Thank you. That's kind of you." She ran her fingers along the counter, then walked to the stove, opening the oven and checking the burners. Without asking. Habit. Muscle memory. The place needed scrubbing, yes, but it had potential. More importantly, it had heart. From the corner of the room, a soft rustling sound emerged. Margaret turned to see a small girl no older than 6 standing. In the doorway in mismatched pajamas, a plush rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide. Daniel immediately softened. "Ella, sweetheart, this is Margaret. She's here to help us with meals and things." Ella didn't respond. She took one step forward, then darted behind the wall again. "She's shy," Daniel said with a sad smile. "She used to be more outgoing, but after Everything, she's been different. Ben, my son, is older. He's quieter, but it's a different kind of quiet. Protective. Too grown up for 9. Margaret's heart twinged at the words. Children forced to grow up too fast. She'd seen it before. Felt it in her bones. "I can start with something simple," she said. "Maybe lunch. Something warm, familiar." Daniel's expression changed then, not just gratitude, but something like hope. "You'd really be willing to start today?" She glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon. "There's no time like the present." He looked like he might actually cry. "Thank you, Margaret, really." Margaret opened the fridge, scanning its contents. It was sparse eggs, a carton of milk, some vegetables that were threatening to go bad, and a pack of hot dogs. She pulled out what she needed and moved with quiet confidence, finding a cutting board, boiling water, and humming softly as she worked. Daniel watched her for a moment, almost in disbelief. "You're very calm," Margaret chuckled gently. "I've lived a long time. I've learned that panic doesn't get the potatoes peeled any faster." He laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. As she chopped and stirred, he leaned on the doorway. "The ad, it didn't say much, I know. I just didn't know how to write it. I didn't want someone just doing a job. I was hoping for someone who'd care. For real." Margaret didn't look up from the pan. "What made you think I would?" He paused, then said, "You knocked. That told me everything." There was a long silence after that, filled only by the bubbling of the pot and the soft scraping of a spoon. When the meal was done, macaroni and cheese with carrots sautéed in a little butter and garlic, Margaret plated it and brought it to the table. "Simple, but fresh," she said. "Comfort food," Daniel called the children. Ben appeared first. Cautious but polite. He nodded at Margaret, said, "Thank you," in a voice too polite for his age, and sat down. Ella followed, still holding her rabbit. She climbed into her chair without a word. They ate in silence for the first few minutes. Margaret didn't push conversation. She simply watched as the food slowly disappeared, as Ella finally looked up at her as Ben took a second helping without. Asking Daniel, meanwhile, sat across the table, his fork idle in his hand. He wasn't watching the food. He was watching them. Watching his children eat, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. "I don't know how to explain it," he said quietly after a while, "but this feels different, better." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Food is never just food. It's comfort. It's safety. It's a reason to sit together." Daniel nodded slowly. "Would you consider staying? Not just today, I mean long term?" Margaret met his eyes for the first time in full. There was nothing desperate in his voice, just honesty. A man asking for help not for himself, but for his children. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Let's take it one day at a time." And just like that, the job was hers. But none of them knew yet that what had begun as a cooking job would quietly transform into something else entirely, something like family. The next few days passed with a kind of quiet rhythm, awkward at first, but steady. Like a new song, everyone was still learning the steps to. Margaret arrived early each morning just after the sun rose, bundled in her usual wool coat and carrying a small notebook filled with handwritten recipes. She let herself in with the spare key Daniel had offered her on the second day, placed her bag by the front door, and tied on a clean apron like it was a ritual one that gave her purpose again. She started with breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon, and chopped apples one day, eggs with toast, and fresh fruit the next. It was simple food, but she made it with care, and it didn't go unnoticed. The children, however, remained cautious. Ben, ever the protector, rarely spoke unless spoken to. He watched her like a little guardian, analyzing her every move. He ate without complaint but never smiled. His posture was straight at the table, shoulders stiff, as though unsure whether to relax. Ella was more of a mystery. She often hid behind her stuffed rabbit, Bunny, peeking at Margaret from over its soft ears. She would sometimes stare, without blinking, then vanish from the room the moment Margaret looked back. Still, Margaret didn't push. She'd raised gardens before she knew that rushing growth only ruined the roots. You water, you wait, and you hope the sun eventually shows. Daniel, for his part, looked both relieved and guilty. He worked from the dining room most days, typing on his laptop, occasionally muttering through Zoom calls. Between meetings, he'd help unload the dishwasher or fold laundry, always apologizing for how behind everything was. "You're not behind," Margaret told him one afternoon as she kneaded dough for dinner rolls. "You're surviving." He gave a tired laugh. "It feels like failing." Margaret glanced at him, her hand still moving over the dough. "There's no failure in love, just different ways of holding on." That silenced him for a moment. Then he nodded and returned to his work, her words lingering longer than he expected. In the evenings, she stayed a little later than planned. At first, it was just to finish tidying the kitchen, but soon it became about more than chores. She noticed Ben struggling with his math homework and offered to help. When Ella scraped her knee tripping over a toy, Margaret fetched a Band-Aid and sat with her until the crying stopped. And though they didn't say much, the children started watching her a little more closely. Trust, it seemed, was forming not quickly, but steadily. One morning, on her fourth day, Margaret arrived to find a small surprise. On the kitchen counter sat a folded piece of paper. Her name was written on the front in uneven pencil strokes. Inside, in a child's shaky handwriting, were just two words: "Thank you." No signature. But Margaret didn't need one. Her throat tightened as she gently closed the note and slipped it into her apron pocket. That day, she made pancakes shaped like hearts. Still, the emotional landscape of the house was delicate, like walking on thin ice. Every laugh from Ella, was followed by a glance toward her father as if checking whether it was okay to be happy again. Every smile from Ben felt hard-earned and short-lived. There was grief here, Margaret understood. Thick, layered grief. The kind that wrapped itself around even the smallest joys and tried to squeeze Dot, and yet beneath it, there was love. So much love that it leaked out in quiet ways. Ben tucking in Ella's blanket before bed, Daniel writing tiny notes for the kids' lunchboxes, Ella leaving her bunny on Margaret's chair as if offering a piece of herself in secret that night. After the kids had gone to sleep, Margaret and Daniel shared a cup of tea in the kitchen. It had become a routine by now. 10 minutes of calm before she headed home. "I know you're technically the cook," he said, watching the steam rise from his mug, "but I feel like you're doing a lot more than feeding us." Margaret smiled softly. "Sometimes feeding the stomach feeds the soul, too." He looked at her, really looked at her. "They're changing. You're helping them. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," she said gently. "I came here to work. I didn't expect to care so much, but I do." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew it. Margaret was no longer just a visitor in the house. She was becoming part of its fabric. In the quiet of the kitchen, surrounded by cooling dishes and echoes of laughter, Margaret felt it too. A subtle shift. A soft, unexpected pull in her chest. The kind that whispered, "You belong here." It was a Wednesday afternoon when the silence finally cracked. Margaret was in the kitchen, humming a tune from her childhood, soft and low, barely more than a breath. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, and inside, the scent of fresh chocolate chip cookies filled the air. She hadn't planned on baking that day, but something in the stillness of the house felt heavy. Daniel was out running errands, for the first time in a week, trusting Margaret alone with the kids. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Ben was sitting at the table, a pencil clutched tightly in his hand, frowning at his homework. Ella sat curled in the corner of the couch in the adjacent room, cradling Bunny, her thumb in her mouth. Margaret placed the warm cookie sheet on a trivet and glanced over. "They're still too hot to eat," she said casually, wiping her hands on a towel. "But I made them with brown butter. That was Henry's favorite." Ben didn't look up. "Who's Henry?" Margaret blinked, startled. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation with her. She walked over and sat across from him. "My husband. He passed away a few years ago." "Oh," Ben paused. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said gently. "I'm sorry." "About your mom." He stared down at his notebook. "It's weird now. At school, everyone looks at me funny, like I'm going to cry all the time. Do you cry?" she asked softly. "Not at school." She nodded, respecting that boundary. After a moment, Ben added, "Dad cries in the bathroom when he thinks we're asleep." Margaret felt her chest tighten. That means he's strong. Strong people let it out when they need to. He didn't say anything for a while, just scribbled a few lines on his worksheet. Then, "Are the cookies really that good?" Margaret smiled. Only one way to find out. He stood abruptly and crossed the kitchen, carefully selecting one from the sheet. He took a bite, his face remaining neutral for a few seconds, then broke into a quiet "moo." He looked at her and for the first time truly smiled. Ella peered around the corner, watching the exchange. Margaret noticed and called out, "Would you like one, sweetheart?" Ella didn't respond. Instead, she stood silently for a moment, then slowly walked over and climbed onto a kitchen chair, her bunny still tucked tightly under one arm. She didn't reach for a cookie until Margaret slid a plate in front of her, already cooled, with a tiny glass of milk beside it. Ella nibbled at the cookie like a small mouse. "Mommy made cookies sometimes," she said quietly. Margaret leaned in. "Did she have a special recipe?" Ella nodded. She put extra vanilla in, and she let us lick the bowl. Well, Margaret said, her voice warm, maybe you can. Help me bake next time. We'll do it just like she did. Ella's eyes lit up for the first time. Can Bunny help too? Margaret chuckled. Of course. Bunny can be the official bowl licker. The laugh that came from Ella was sudden and bright, unexpected, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Ben looked up at his sister in surprise, then back at Margaret with a quiet wonder in his eyes. Later that evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Daniel returned home, soaked from the rain and juggling grocery bags. Something smells amazing, he said, shaking off his coat. Ben stood and helped unload the bags without being asked. Ella hopped down from her seat and offered Daniel a cookie with both hands, the bunny clutched under her chin. Daniel raised an eyebrow at Margaret. You drugged the cookies, didn't you? Margaret laughed. Brown butter never fails. They ate dinner like a family that night, not just sharing food, but sharing stories. Ben talked about a drawing he made in school. Ella sang part of a silly song she remembered from her mom. Daniel, stunned into silence at first, just listened with wide, grateful eyes. After the children went to bed, Daniel lingered at the table. With Margaret. What did you do? He asked in disbelief. They've been so quiet for so long. I listened, she said simply. And I fed them cookies. He leaned back, eyes glistening. You're doing something in this house I didn't think was possible. Margaret didn't respond right away. Her gaze drifted to the hallway where the kids had disappeared. They just needed a reason to come out of hiding. Grief makes people small. Love makes them brave again. Daniel nodded slowly. You're not just helping. You're healing something in them. She looked back at him and said, They're healing me too. In the quiet that followed, the rain continued to fall outside, soft and steady. But inside, the house was changing, becoming warmer, fuller, louder with laughter and life. And Margaret, once a lonely widow knocking on a stranger's door, was beginning to feel the stirrings of something she hadn't dared hope for. Belonging. Margaret stood in the doorway of the children's playroom one afternoon, watching as Ella tried to braid her bunny's ears while Ben built a lopsided fort out of couch cushions and blankets. The room was alive now, no longer just a storage space of untouched toys and silent shadows. Laughter bubbled up between the two siblings like sunlight through cracked windows. It caught her off guard. How natural this felt. She leaned against the frame, fingers tightening around a folded tea towel. Her heart was full, but there was a quiet ache resting just beneath it. It rose slowly, like an old song drifting into her mind, one she hadn't played in years. The ache had a name. Henry. She saw him in Ben's quiet protectiveness, in Ella's scattered joy, in the way Daniel's eyes softened when he looked at his children, unaware of the gentleness he wore like armor. It all brought pieces of her past into the present. She walked into the kitchen to give herself a moment alone. The kettle was still warm from earlier, so she poured herself a cup of chamomile and sat at the table, letting the steam rise into her face like a curtain. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup absent-like. She and Henry had always talked about having children. They'd tried for years. Doctor visits, whispered prayers, hopeful mornings followed by heartbroken nights. But it never happened. They filled their home with other joys, gardening, community dinners, music, friends. They were happy. Truly. But even happiness can have a hollow room where something never arrived. And when Henry passed just 6 months after retiring, it felt like a door slammed shut on every version of the life they could. They had. She had grown used to silence after that. The kind that echoed inside you, not just around you. Her house became a museum of memories, neat and untouched. Like if she didn't disturb anything, he might still walk through the door. But now, things were shifting. Now there were fingerprints on tabletops, toy cars underfoot, crayon marks on her apron that Ella had accidentally left while hugging her. Margaret wasn't just watching life happen. She was in it again. She was needed. A small knock interrupted her thoughts. Ella stood at the doorway of the kitchen, one sock on, her hair wild and eyes thoughtful. Bunny, of course, in tow. "Are you sad?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Margaret smiled gently. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? You looked like Mommy used to." When she thought I wasn't looking, Margaret didn't lie. "Sometimes I do feel sad. I miss someone I loved very much." Ella shuffled forward and placed Bunny in Margaret's lap. "You can borrow him if you want." It was such a simple gesture, such a generous one. Margaret felt her throat close up as she pulled the child into a soft hug, holding her close. Ella didn't resist. She leaned in, head on Margaret's shoulder. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "That's very kind of you." Ella sat with her for a while, no words between them, only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of the house settling around them. Later that evening, when the children were asleep, Margaret stood beside Daniel in the living room, folding clean laundry while a quiet folk song played on the old radio. "She gave me her rabbit today," Margaret said softly. Daniel looked over, eyebrows raised. "That's serious. Bunny's basically royalty around here." Margaret laughed lightly. It felt like a ceremony. He smiled, folding a towel. "They love you. I don't think they understand it fully yet, but they feel safe with you. I can see it in the way they relax when you're near." Margaret stared down at the tiny socks in her hands. "I never got to be a mother," she said. "But now, I don't know what this is exactly, but it matters to me." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't have to define it. Just let it be what it is." She nodded, grateful for the lack of pressure. He wasn't asking her to fill a role. He was simply honoring the one she'd already begun stepping into. Margaret left that night with Bunny still tucked in her bag, a temporary guardian against old grief. At home, she placed the rabbit on her bedside table and sat for a long while in the quiet. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of quiet that makes room for healing. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for life to return. Life was here, and she was part of it again. By the end of the second week, Margaret's presence had become more than routine. It had become a comfort. The children stopped waiting for her to arrive. They simply assumed she would be there, and she always was. Ella began leaving her drawings on the kitchen table in the morning, stick figure families, with Margit carefully labeled among them. Ben had taken to sitting next to her during meals instead of across from her, occasionally nudging her elbow to show her funny things in his homework. Daniel noticed it all, and though he tried not to say much, it was written across his face. He looked lighter these days. The circles under his eyes were still there, but they weren't as dark. His shoulders weren't always hunched with exhaustion. He smiled more, laughed more, sometimes even joined the kids on the floor during playtime, which hadn't happened in months. Margaret felt the shift happening, slow and certain, like spring waking up under the snow. She was folding laundry one afternoon when she came across a small pink sweater. Ella's missing one button. Instead of tossing it aside, she went to her purse, pulled out a sewing kit, and sat by the window to repair it. She hadn't done this sort of thing in years, but her hands remembered. She was halfway through sewing when Ella climbed into the chair beside her and rested her chin on the armrest. "Did you ever have a daughter?" she asked, out of nowhere. Margaret paused, her needle mid-thread. She looked down at the little girl beside her and shook her head. "No, I didn't. I wanted one very much." Ella considered this. "Why didn't you?" "Sometimes, no matter how much you hope for something, it doesn't happen," Margaret said gently. "But I got to love other things, my garden, my husband, my neighbors." "But not a daughter," Ella whispered. Margaret nodded. not a daughter." Ella reached over and touched her hand. "You can have me if you want." The thread slipped from Margaret's fingers. She looked at the child so serious, so sincere, and felt something break open in her chest. Carefully, she cupped Ella's cheek in her hand. "I would be honored," she said softly. That evening, when Daniel came home from an errand, he found Ella asleep on the couch with her head in Margaret's lap, a book open beside them. Margaret looked up and gave him a sheepish smile. "We didn't make it to the end of the story." Daniel just stood there for a moment, unsure whether to speak. Then he said, "I haven't seen her this relaxed in. I don't even remember when." "She's just tired," Margaret replied quietly, brushing Ella's hair back from her forehead. "No," Daniel said. "She's safe." "That's what this is." Margaret looked down at the child in her lap and then back at him. "I'm just doing what I can." Daniel stepped forward and sat down on the edge of the coffee table. "You're doing more than that. You're giving them something I didn't know how to give: stability, presence, warmth." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "They're easy to love. And you do love them, don't you?" he asked, not accusingly, but with gentle curiosity. She hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't come here looking for them, but they found me anyway." Daniel rubbed his hands together. "I was so scared when I put that note up at church. I thought no one would answer, that no one should answer. Who hires a stranger to come raise their kids?" Margaret smiled. "You didn't hire me to raise your kids. You hired a cook." "Exactly," he said, laughing softly. "And somehow I got so much more." The moment stretched between them, warm and filled with quiet understanding. Neither one needed to say it, but they both knew. Margaret was no longer just helping out. She was becoming family. As the evening deepened and the house settled into its usual quiet, Margaret gently picked Ella up to carry her to bed. Daniel opened the door to the children's room, and she tucked the girl in with the tenderness of a mother who'd practiced the gesture in dreams. Afterward, she stood for a moment in the hallway, looking toward the soft light spilling from the room. "You okay?" Daniel asked. Margaret smiled, a tear tracing down her cheek. "I think, for the first time in a long while, I really am." She left late that night, walking home beneath a moonlit sky, the streets damp with dew. And though her house was still quiet and her bed still empty, something in her had changed. She didn't feel alone anymore. She was carrying two small hearts with her, and they were beginning to carry hers too. It happened on a Friday evening. The rain had started earlier in the day, a soft drizzle that turned into a steady downpour by late afternoon. Margaret had stayed longer than usual, helping the kids bake a banana bread that filled the house with a warmth and cinnamon. Daniel was upstairs finishing work while Ella and Ben curled up on the couch under a blanket, watching an old animated movie. The thunder came slowly at first, distant grumbles rolling across the sky. Margaret didn't think much of it until she noticed Ella shivering, even under the blanket. She crossed the room. "Are you cold, sweetheart?" Ella didn't answer. Her skin was pale, and her eyes, which had been fluttering just moments ago, were glassy. Ben leaned in. "She's been tired all day." She didn't even eat the banana bread. Margaret crouched in front of her and touched her forehead. The heat was immediate, burning, and unmistakable. A fever dot, she gently pressed the back of her hand to the girl's cheek and looked at Ben. "Can you go get your dad for me?" "Right away." Ben nodded and ran up the stairs. Margaret scooped Ella into her arms. The girl whimpered, her head falling against Margaret's shoulder. Her body felt heavy, limp in a way that made Margaret's stomach twist. She grabbed a throw blanket and wrapped it around Ella as she moved to the couch. Daniel came thundering down the stairs. "What happened?" "She's burning up," Margaret said. It came on fast. Her breathing's shallow. Daniel rushed to his daughter's side, brushing her damp hair back. She was fine this morning. Children can change in hours, Margaret said calmly. Do you have a thermometer? Upstairs, he said. I'll get it. While Daniel dashed back up, Margaret kept her hand on Ella's back, humming a lullaby without even realizing it, an old tune from her own childhood. Ella whimpered again, but didn't move. Daniel returned moments later, fumbling with the thermometer. Margaret took it gently from his hands, slipping it under Ella's arm. They waited in silence. When it beeped, she read the number and looked. Up 103.8, she said quietly. Daniel paled. Should I take her to the E? Maybe, Margaret said. But let's try to bring it down first. She's alert and her breathing is still steady. We have a window. She instructed him to bring cool cloths and water while she carried Ella upstairs to her room, laying her gently in bed and propping her up with pillows. She stayed by her side, stroking her arm, whispering soothing words. Daniel came in with the supplies, visibly shaken. I'm not good at this, he muttered. I don't know what I'm doing. You don't have to be perfect, Margaret said, wringing out a cloth and placing it gently on Ella's forehead. You just have to be here. I am here, he said, but it doesn't feel like enough. It is, she said firmly, and she knows it. Together, they took turns cooling Ella down and coaxing her to sip water. At one point, she stirred and looked up at Margaret through fever-glazed eyes. Stay, Ella whispered. I'm not going anywhere, darling, Margaret replied. Brushing a curl from the girl's damp cheek. It took nearly 2 hours, but the fever began to ease. Margaret stayed at Ella's side the entire time. Daniel hovered nearby, occasionally pacing or sitting on the edge of the bed. As if afraid to blink. At some point, Ben crept into the room and climbed into Margaret's lap. Without a word, she wrapped an arm around him and held him close. He didn't cry, but he leaned into her like she was the one safe place he knew. By midnight, Ella was sleeping soundly, her cheeks less flushed. Margaret finally stood, stretching her stiff joints. Daniel watched her closely. I don't know how you stayed so calm. I've had practice, she said with a tired smile. Not as a mother, but as someone who's seen enough fear to know that panic never helps. He exhaled slowly. I couldn't have done this without you. She shook her head. You didn't need to. You weren't alone. His eyes searched hers, then quiet, vulnerable. We haven't been alone since you knocked on our door, have we? Margaret looked down at the sleeping girl, then at Ben, who was now curled under a blanket on the rug. No, she whispered. You haven't. As Daniel walked her to the door, the house silent but still breathing with the weight of the night, Margaret paused on the porch. The rain had stopped. Stay for breakfast? Daniel asked softly. She turned to him, eyes tired but full. I'll bring cinnamon rolls, he nodded. Good. They'll need something warm tomorrow. She walked home in the quiet, shoes soaking wet, but her heart oddly light. She wasn't just helping a family anymore. She was family. The next morning, the house felt different, not louder, not brighter, but steadier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The storm had passed, both outside and in. Margaret arrived just after sunrise, carrying a small pan of homemade cinnamon rolls still warm from the oven. The sweet scent followed her into the house as she let herself in, expecting to find the usual soft morning chaos. Cereal boxes, sleepy yawns, last-minute homework. Instead, she found silence. For a brief moment, her heart caught, had something gone wrong? But then she heard a sound from the kitchen, soft humming. She stepped inside and found Daniel, already up, sleeves rolled, attempting to make coffee. He turned, startled by her arrival. Oh, hey, you're early. You're up, she replied, equally surprised. I didn't sleep much, he said. Kept checking on Ella, but she's better. Temp stayed down all night. Thank God. Margaret murmured, setting the pan down on the counter. Daniel walked over and lifted the towel covering the cinnamon rolls. These smell like childhood, Margaret chuckled. They were always my husband's favorite. We used to bake them on Sunday mornings. He'd eat half the tray before they cooled. Henry, right? She nodded, pleased he remembered. Yes. He had a ridiculous sweet tooth. Daniel smiled, then grew quiet. I've been thinking a lot since last night. She didn't reply right away, just waited. He rubbed the back of his neck. When I put up that ad, I thought I was asking for a cook, but what I was really asking for was help. Not just with meals or laundry, but with the loneliness. With the fear that I couldn't give these kids what they needed. You've done your best, she said gently. But you came in, he continued, and everything changed. You didn't just cook. You healed. You love them. And they love you. Margaret felt something flicker in her chest. A cautious hope. They've changed me too. He nodded, voice softer now. I've watched them become kids again. Ben makes jokes. Ella laughs in her sleep. They run to you before. They run to me, and I'm okay with that. She smiled sadly. I never thought I'd be in this place, that I'd get to feel needed again. Daniel stepped forward, sincerity etched into every line of his face. Margaret, I don't want this to be temporary. I don't want you to go home every night to an empty house. I don't want my kids to wake up one day and wonder where you went. Her breath caught. I know this started as a job, he said, but I'd like you to stay, as long as you'll have us. Not as an employee, as part of this family. The kitchen fell quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret stared at him, this tired, kind man who had once opened his door to a stranger and now stood asking her to stay. Not out of pity, not out of desperation, but out of love. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm not sure I know how to be a mother, she whispered. Daniel's voice was steady. You already are. She looked down, swallowing the lump in her throat. Then slowly she nodded. Then yes. I'll stay. At that exact moment, tiny footsteps pattered down the hall. Ben appeared first, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He spotted the cinnamon rolls and gave a sleepy grin. You came back. Of course I did, Margaret said. I always will. Ella came next, hair sticking out in all directions, dragging Bunny by one ear. She walked over to Margaret without a word and wrapped her arms around her waist. Daniel stood by the counter, watching the scene unfold. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That morning they sat down at the table, Margaret, Daniel, Ben, and Ella, and shared warm cinnamon rolls as the sun rose through the windows. There were no speeches, no fanfare, no grand announcements. But the air was different. A choice had been made. A family had been found. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like she was filling a role or helping someone else's story. She was living her own in a house where laughter returned, where children leaned in close, and where she was no longer the woman with no one waiting for her. Now, someone always was. The change wasn't marked by a ceremony or a contract or even a conversation. It simply happened. Margaret moved in, not all at once, but in quiet, practical steps. First, a drawer in the kitchen for her utensils and spices. Then a shelf in the hallway closet for her sweaters. Eventually, Daniel cleared out the guest room, formerly a storage catch-all of broken toys and boxes, and transformed it into a warm, cozy space with a view of the backyard. He didn't call it Margaret's room. He called it home base. That made her laugh. The children didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Margaret being there all the time made sense to them. It felt right. In the mornings, the house now stirred with a rhythm of its own. Daniel made coffee while Margaret packed school lunches. Ben fed the dog. They finally agreed to adopt a floppy-eared mutt named Pickle, and Ella followed Margaret. Around the kitchen, sometimes in pajamas, always chatting about dreams or coloring ideas or what she thought clouds were made of, Margaret soaked it all in. She'd lived in a quiet house for years, the kind where clocks ticked louder than voices. Now she woke up to the sound of tiny feet running down the hallway, laughter echoing from the bathroom, and Ella announcing the day's weather like a news anchor from under her blanket. Every moment felt borrowed, and yet completely hers. One chilly Saturday morning, Margaret stood in the yard, watching Ben and Ella race each other through piles of crunchy autumn leaves. Daniel sat on the porch steps beside her, sipping from a travel mug. "She's faster than she looks," Daniel sighed, gesturing toward Ella, who had just leapt triumphantly into a leaf pile. "She gets that from you," Margaret replied. He smiled. "The stubbornness is probably from both of us." Margaret chuckled, crossing her arms. "Ben's growing taller every week." "Did you notice?" Daniel nodded. "And his math grades are finally improving. I think having a steady routine again is helping. And someone to check his homework," Margaret teased. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the children play. Then Daniel said, more softly, "You know, when Julia died, I was sure we'd never get back to normal." Margaret turned toward him, listening. "But maybe this isn't about going back to normal. Maybe this is something new." She nodded. "A new chapter," he glanced at her. "And you're written all over it." Margaret didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. This chapter, this new life, wasn't something she had expected, but it had filled the empty pages of her heart with purpose again. Later that afternoon, Ella appeared in the living room holding a wrinkled piece of notebook paper. "What's this?" Margaret asked, sitting on the couch. Ella beamed. "It's our family tree." Margaret carefully unfolded the paper. Stick figures stood beneath hand-drawn branches. There was Daniel at the bottom, labeled Dad, with Ben and Ella next to him. Above them, a house, a dog, and a big smiling sun. But what caught Margaret's breath was the drawing of herself next to the kids. Under a heart labeled Mom Number 2, she looked up at Ella, her voice trembling. "You drew me in." Ella shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Well, you're ours now." Daniel, standing in the doorway, met Margaret's eyes. No words were exchanged. None were needed. That night, Margaret sat in her new room, no longer the guest room, but hers. She tucked the family tree into her bedside drawer beside Henry's photograph. She imagined he would have smiled at this strange twist of fate, at how life had folded her into someone else's story in the most unexpected way. But it wasn't just someone else's story anymore. It was hers. The house had changed. So had the people inside it. Grief hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled the air they breathed. Laughter returned, not as a mask, but as medicine. And love? It showed up in lunchbox notes, bedtime stories, clean laundry, and cinnamon rolls on sleepy mornings. This was a home again. And Margaret, once only a cook who knocked on a door, was now the heart of it. There was a smell of apples and cinnamon in the air, the kind of smell that wraps around you like a knit blanket and whispers, "You're home." The kitchen was filled. With it, Margaret's signature apple pie baking in the oven, its golden crust bubbling gently while the children colored pictures at the table. It had been 6 months since the night Margaret stayed by Ella's bedside. 6 months since Daniel made the offer that changed all their lives. 6 months since a lonely widow, who once stood quietly on a stranger's porch, had found herself in the middle of a loud, loving, messy, imperfect family. And now it all felt ordinary, but not in the dull way. In the beautiful, reliable, steady way. Ordinary, like how the sun rises every morning. She turned away from the oven and smiled. 5 more minutes. Ben gave an exaggerated groan. You said 5 more minutes. 5 minutes ago. Daniel looked up from his laptop at the other end of the kitchen. Math check. How many 5s in 10? Ben rolled his eyes, but he was grinning. 2. Smart boy, Margaret said, ruffling his hair as she passed. Which means 2. More minutes until pie. Ella held up her drawing. I made this for you. Margaret leaned down. It was a picture of the whole family, her, Daniel, Ben, Ella, and Pickle the dog standing outside their home. The words at the top, written in colorful block letters, said, Our forever family. Her throat tightened. That's beautiful, sweetheart. Ella shrugged like it was no big deal. It's just true. The oven beeped, and Margaret turned to pull the pie out. The crust was perfect golden, flaky, with hints of steam rising and curling through the warm kitchen air. The kids gathered around. As she placed it on the table, Daniel stood and helped get out plates and forks, while Pickle circled hopefully beneath their feet. All right, Daniel said. Who's cutting the first slice? Margaret? Both kids said at once. She laughed, hand on her heart. I'm honored. As she carefully sliced the pie, Margaret let her eyes wander around the room. The kitchen walls now held children's drawings alongside old family photos. The fridge had a shopping list covered in sticky notes, and a weekly calendar that somehow was always full: soccer practices, library visits, doctor's appointments. Everything about this life was different from the one she had known with Henry Quieter. In some ways, but fuller in others. It wasn't a replacement for the past. It was something new. Something that honored where she'd been, but rooted her in the present. And more importantly, it gave her a future. After pie, Ben and Ella went outside with Pickle, tossing a half-deflated ball around the yard. Daniel lingered at the sink, rinsing plates. You don't have to clean, Margaret said, joining him. Habit, he replied with a smile. Old instincts. There was a pause between them, comfortable silence stretching like soft cloth. Then Daniel said, They asked me last night if you'd ever leave. Margaret looked at him, surprised. And what did you say? I told them you're staying forever. If you want to. She blinked slowly, her voice quiet. I do. Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners. Good. Outside, the kids squealed with laughter as Pickle bounded through a pile of leaves. The late afternoon sun made the kitchen glow, catching bits of dust like glitter in the air. This was love, Margaret thought. Not the kind that sweeps you off your feet. The kind that roots you, that builds slowly day by day. In lunchboxes, in tucked-in blankets, in the sound of laughter echoing down the hall. In the smell of baking pie and the weight of little arms. Around your waist. It was a quiet miracle. A lonely widow had once knocked on a door with a pie recipe and a hope to be useful. And now she was a mother. A friend. A cornerstone. She was home. Epilogue. Months later, a new neighbor moved in across the street, a single mom with a toddler and tired eyes. One morning, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Margaret standing there, with a basket of muffins and a warm smile. I was told you might need a hand, she said gently, because love, once given, doesn't stop at the edge of your own doorstep. It finds ways to ripple outward, just like family.